In Shovik Mukherjee's Playing Subaltern Video Games and Post-Colonialism, he points out that colonial empire has always been described in terms of the ludic. 19th century adventurers in Central Asia, exploring and marking out potential territory for their English or Russian masters, called their enterprise of espionage, surveillance, and mapping the Great Game, or the Tournament of Shadows. Dominating your environment, extracting resources through discovery or violence, saving kingdoms, subduing your enemies and pillaging sacred artifacts. Am I talking about colonialism? Or video games? Maybe both. The metaphor of gameplay has always been important to colonialism, and the metaphors and narratives cemented by colonialism have always been important to video games. Nowhere is this more observable than in one of the most successful and beloved video game series of all time, The Legend of Zelda. The Legend of Zelda is a high fantasy, action-adventure video game franchise developed by Japanese video game company Nintendo. The series debuted with its first title, The Legend of Zelda, in Japan in 1986, and in 1987 it had its North American and Europe release. Since then, 30 game titles, including original titles, ports and remakes, have been added to the series, expanding upon the franchise's diverse mix of gameplay genres, including elements of role-playing, puzzles, combat, adventure, exploration, stealth, and racing. The Legend of Zelda is the 20th best-selling video game series of all time. As of June 2023, the series has sold over 160.491 million units worldwide, making it the longest-running action-adventure game series in the world. It has spawned a devoted and enthusiastic global fanbase, particularly in Japan, Europe and America, who congregate online to analyse, explore and discuss the series. The impact The Legend of Zelda has had on the development of video games and the formation of gaming culture is profound and widespread, which is why it's so important to analyse the series' content and remain critical about its representations, themes and ideas. I for one am a huge Legend of Zelda fan. I also believe the series can be very easily read as Orientalist, and I believe exploring this reading is necessary for 3 key reasons. Number 1, it helps highlight the dissemination of Orientalist ideas on a global scale and how easily and insidiously they make their way into media. 2, it confronts how the unique mechanics and potentialities of gaming as a medium can be complicit in resurrecting and perpetuating regressive ideas. And number 3, it helps us all remember that it's totally possible to love a piece of media and be highly critical of it. With that said, let's get into it, starting by answering a very important question. Just what exactly is Orientalism? Orientalism, a term coined by Palestinian post-colonial scholar Edward Said in his
1978
book of the same name, describes the Western imperialist creation of a series of representations, ideologies, and binaries to construct the Orient. This Orient was a shifting, ever-changing production that primarily represented Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Ergo, the parts of the world that were colonized by Western Europe after the rise of modern settler colonialism in the 1500s. Said argued that Orientalism was defined by a paradoxical dichotomy, which here means by two opposing ideas that oppose one another in such a way that the concept itself does not make sense. This dichotomy was as follows. 1. The Orient is a realm of delight, of mystery, exoticism, spirituality, enlightenment, sensuality, freedom, and indulgence. And number 2, the Orient is a realm of depravity, of savagery, of disease, of ignorance, of squalor, of moral sadism, and of deep oppression, a subhuman and monstrous place. This rendered the quote-unquote Orient oppositional or other to the West, keeping the colonized world in a constant state of upheaval, disruption, and insecurity. And it presented Western Europe as its benevolent moral saviour, compelled to explore it and control it for its own good. It's important to recognise that the Orient was not just constructed to simply misrepresent the colonised world, nor was it an honest misunderstanding or misinterpretation of non-Western parts of the world by innocent travellers and explorers. Orientalism was deliberately, maliciously created in order to justify, normalise, and fuel the process of Western colonisation. Why? There are many reasons. One is to enhance support for colonial occupation back home and abroad. Another is justification.
British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? To remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
So that colonialists could refer to some motivation beyond greed and self-interest for their actions. Another is that it helps explain away certain uncomfortable cultural differences, attitudes to gender, sexuality, lifestyle and race that cultures in Africa, Asia and the Middle East had, that not only made Western Europeans at that time highly uncomfortable, but also threatened their social norms and hierarchies. Regardless of the reason why, Orientalism helped moralise colonialism, rendering the physical, mental and spatial occupation of colonised peoples, alongside the extraction of their territory, resources and knowledge, a necessary, even noble feat. Orientalism and colonialism have never gone away. They have simply shifted forms and tactics. Their ideas have been imported to and entrenched in almost every culture on Earth, including Japan, which has a lengthy colonial history and distinctive attitudes to race, gender and the West that have been shaped by that history. Post-colonial theorists like Frantz Fanon, Homi K. Bhabha and Gayatri Spivak have worked to interrogate Orientalism, deconstructing what Michel Foucault calls the regimes of truth in historical and contemporary Western culture. From the industries of science, to beauty, to popular media, to travel, to technology, to sports, the influence of Orientalism continues to be interrogated. One area that deserves more attention in this regard? Video games. Video games like The Legend of Zelda. High or epic fantasy is a genre born from medieval European mythology and aesthetics. Think Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, gallant tales of destiny, of princesses, knights, gods, demons, wizards, witches, dragons, goblins, enchanted forests, castles, dungeons, knights and fairies. High fantasy has been criticised by many scholars for its nature as a deeply conservative genre, in contrast to other forms of fantasy like sci-fi and magical realism. China Miéville, fantasy author, argues that this genre, under the guise of historical accuracy, a ridiculous contradiction in a world populated by dragons, monsters and fairies, is one where hierarchies and distinctions of race, gender and sexuality are reinforced, with narratives utilised to uphold conservative forms of power instilled within the genre. The Legend of Zelda fits this description like a glove. Here's some examples of how Zelda's medieval European setting is established in the games. Number 1. The Kingdom of Hyrule has a medieval European feudalistic hierarchy with royals, knights, princesses and peasants. Number 2. Hyrule's royal family belong to a race known as the Hylians, who are humanoid and distinctively European coded, clearly inspired by Tolkien's elves from Lord of the Rings. Number 3. Hyrule Castle is your traditional stone brick medieval fantasy castle, bearing a grand courtyard, royal statues, seats of armour, torches, tapestries and a majestic throne room. Number 4. Twilight Princess even uses real-world medieval artwork in Hyrule Castle, including paintings of Vaux-le-Vicomte and the British Leeds Castle. Number 5. In games like Twilight Princess, the Bridge of Eldin and the Great Hylian Bridge feature merlons, crenelles, and 2 turrets at each side, traditional for medieval European bridges. Number 6. Hyrule's castle town and locations like Kakariko Village, featured in a majority of Zelda games, are medieval fantasy towns, featuring houses with timber frames and straw thatches, alongside bustling taverns and merchant shops, selling jewels, weapons and potions. Number 7. Whilst players can travel by bird in Skyward Sword, sail in Wind Waker, fly using the paraglider in Breath of the Wild, and use Zonai technology in Tears of the Kingdom, most games feature 2 major methods of in-person travel, via foot and by horse, grounding the travel and technology of the series in the limitations of medieval Europe. Number 8. Horse-based combat, a prominent feature of medieval European warfare, is integrated into minigames, major forms of travel, and boss and enemy battles, in games like Ocarina of Time, Breath of the Wild, and Twilight Princess. Number 9. The weapons the player and enemies can obtain and equip for combat and puzzles are those of high fantasy, including swords, shields, spears, bows, cannons, arrows, and various magical devices. Number 10. This medieval influence is further reflected in the common clothing choices seen on non-playable characters in the game, which include cloaks, tunics, leggings, tailored gowns, fleeces, animal furs, and boots. Number 11. The soundtrack of the Zelda games reinforces this setting, featuring flutes, lutes, violins, harps and snare drums. Prominent European medieval instruments. The use of these specific instruments to cultivate a medieval fantasy atmosphere has been so important to the games that older 2D games, including Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, used a MIDI, a musical instrument digital interface, to simulate their specific sounds. The prominence of this medieval European world building becomes especially interesting when we consider that the original intended religion of this series was Christianity. You might be shocked to hear that the original intended religion of the Zelda games was Christianity. After all, the series has its own distinctive, highly detailed mythology that has nothing to do with any real-life religions. Or so it seems. What if I told you that the mythology is not as divorced from Christianity as you might think, and that the Christian coding of Hyrule has important meaning in regards to its setting and potential Orientalism? In the original Japanese version of the first Zelda game, What in Western releases was the Book of Magic, a magical item which harnessed the power of the fire rod, was simply the Bible. In the 1987 title The Adventure of Link, players could collect a biblical cross as an item, and in both of these games the protagonist Link's shield bore a cross identical to those of the medieval Knights of the Holy Crusades. In addition to this, concept art for A Link to the Past, released in 1991, depicted Link kneeling and praying to a statue of Jesus Christ inside a church. Zelda's developers later, of course, replaced this Christian iconography with the distinct Hylian mythology of the series, a mythology that is still heavily inspired by Christianity. For example, take Hyrule's creation mythology, where the three Hylian goddesses, Farour, Naru and Din, descended from a planetary nebula and spent 3 days creating the world. After, the goddesses left the Triforce, an ancient artifact consisting of 3 golden triangles representing courage, wisdom and power, hidden in the sacred realm, to be worshipped by the inhabitants of Hyrule. This process of creation bears similarity to the Christian belief in God's 7-day creation of the earth, and the Hylians' worship of the Triforce, said to ward off evil, has parallels with the Christian worship of the cross. The Triforce can also easily be read as a manifestation of the Holy Trinity, of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Power correlating with God, the Father, courage correlating with Jesus Christ, the Son, and wisdom correlating with the Holy Spirit. This is reinforced by the architecture of Hylian religious temples throughout the games, which feature stained glass windows bearing gods and sages, mirroring the tradition of this in medieval Christian churches with Jesus and his disciples. The Temple of Time in Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess was specifically designed to be identical to a medieval church, full of stained glass windows, steeples, stone bricks, structural arches, and a large interior bell. Even if Christianity was never intended to be the religion of Hyrule, and even if its own mythology did not bear clear Christian influences, the Kingdom of Hyrule would still be coded as Christian. Why? Because there is no way to decouple the representation of a medieval European kingdom from the Christian God. Quick history lesson. The king in a medieval European kingdom was understood as being God's representative on earth. They claimed they were chosen by God and answerable to no one except God, in an idea known as the divine right of kings. The power and legitimacy of their kingdom was defined through God. Ruling was treated as a process of enacting God's Christian will, which is why in medieval Europe the church and state were so closely linked. Bishops and priests were advisors of the king, and it was considered the duty of every political authority, king, queen, prince, or city councilman, to support, sustain, and nurture the church. The rampant Christianity of the era is also infused into its legends and folklore, with stories of fairies and goblins subtly underpinned by religious teachings. For all these reasons, it's impossible to detangle this genre of high fantasy from Christianity. So, Hyrule is coded as Christian. Why does this matter? What does this have to do with Orientalism? A lot. When you consider the historic relationship between Western Orientalism, medieval legends, and Christianity. Walter Rodney in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa contended that missionaries were agents of imperialism. The Christian missionaries were as much part of the colonizing forces as were the explorers, traders, and soldiers. Missionaries were agents of colonialism in the practical sense, whether or not they saw themselves in that light. Walter Rodney goes on to talk about the importance of religious conversion to colonialism, how Christianity was forced onto South Africans under Dutch colonialism, and how Indigenous Canadians were forced into brutal Christian residential schools. Christianity was used in these instances to erase and demonize Indigenous cultures and enforce obedience and conformity, but its use extended far beyond practical means. It was a core part of the mythology underpinning Orientalism. From the Middle Ages to the rise of the Victorian Empire, Western Europe had remained on the whole staunchly Christian. Christianity informed much of life, much of people's identities, and much of concepts like the nation. For this reason, colonialism was imagined as a mission on behalf of God, all of its agents, soldiers, explorers, and literal missionaries, serving to convert the godless, misguided Orient and spread the gospel of Christ. The Christian character of Western civilization was used by Orientalists as evidence of its moral benevolence, sanitizing colonial violence, exploitation, and genocide as necessary acts to cure the heathen immorality, depravity, and chaos of the Orient. Colonizing was taking control, in the same way an adult takes control to stop a child from drinking bleach. It was for their own good, in order to civilize and save them from themselves, from their own primitive, nonsensical, wayward desires. Remember what I said about Orientalism helping to explain away certain uncomfortable cultural differences? Well, Christianity was used to demonize and erase these differences from history altogether, influencing the hyper-conservative nature of many formerly colonized African, Middle Eastern, and Asian countries today. Because of the intense Christianity of the medieval period and its pure European aesthetics, the medieval kingdom was also romanticized by Orientalists as part of the pantheon of great Western culture. Orientalists looked to Arthurian and medieval fantasies of chivalrous knights and pure noble maidens to fuel myths of the superior culture, morality, ethics, and history of the West. More than anything, Christianity was used to position the West as a moral, civilized, utopian place, God's kingdom, with the divine right to rule all others. Keep this idea of the Christian kingdom as a utopia in mind as we return to Hyrule. What do you imagine when you think of a utopia? Well, utopian scholar Robert Fishman
Greetings!
argues that utopia embodies the achievement of a natural harmony, the natural harmony, of man, society, and the environment. This image of utopia as a harmonious pastoral idyllic is very Christian, bringing to mind the lush natural space of the Garden of Eden. This isn't surprising considering the concept of heaven is perhaps the foundational utopia, a promised place without war, suffering, or conflict that often sounds too good to be true. Medieval European literature shared this Christian vision, imagining heaven as a lush, open, green space, representing the purity of God's vision. Hyrule, with its vast overworld, featuring open fields, forests, lakes, seas, islands, and deserts, completely untouched by man-made intervention, fits this Christian medieval vision of utopia. Whilst the Zelda series has satellites of civilization like villages and Hyrule Castle, most of the games involve expansive open-world exploration throughout the fields, skies, and seas. This association is strengthened by dialogue in games like the Minish Cap, that is reminiscent of the passage of Genesis in the Bible, of Link as a godlike hero who drove out the darkness with a sword and golden light. There's also the fact that the hierarchy of Hyrule is never implied to induce true misery or suffering. In all the games where we experience Hyrule in equilibrium, it is portrayed as a largely utopian environment. In the Minish Cap, for example, Hyrule initially flourishes with happy traders and gleeful citizens, those who manage to rent from the local landlord saying, "Oh fabulous, it's so clean and so new." Hotels offer gifts for every guest, and the dialogue of random townspeople praise how wonderful and perfect Hyrule is. There is no hint of slavery or inequality in Hyrule, and Princess Zelda's high status implies the kingdom is a realm of widespread sexual equality. In Zelda lore, the Hylian royal family have been divinely chosen to rule by the goddess Hylia, mirroring the divine right of kings, imbuing them with a divine superiority comparable to the Orientalist narrative. The white Christians are the natural leaders and inheritors of the earth. In Zelda, the catalyst for chaos, destruction, and violence is almost always a challenge to the authority of the Hylian royal family, framing their rule as not only righteous and benevolent, but also necessary to maintain order. This is strengthened by the fact that those who attempt to overthrow the Hylian throne are either presented as stupid and comical, like the Yiga of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, or as evil, like Ganondorf. They have no legitimate reasons or criticisms beyond blind hate and craving power. Jeremy Black, author of Imperial Legacies, argued the utopian discourse of the West as a benevolent ruler, saving the Orient from self-imposed chaos and anarchy, helped to enforce a critical Orientalist narrative. This narrative is that colonized people were incapable of ruling themselves, and grateful for the intervention of colonialists and the supposed peace, morality and order their control brought. In this context, the repeating dynamic within the Zelda series between the primary defenders of the Hylian throne, Link and Zelda, versus its primary threat, Ganondorf, contributes immensely to its potential Orientalism. Orientalism has always been a heavily gendered phenomenon, heavily gendered by the ideas that colonialists drew from their own patriarchal cultures. The Orient as a whole was imagined as feminine, irresolute, out of control, chaotic, latently sensual, incapable of self-governance and desperately needing to be saved and educated. Its masculine teacher and saviour, the enlightened, rational, paternalistic West. This was, and still remains, the dominant gendering of the Orient, but it isn't the only one. These representations shift, very self-servingly, in moments when the Orient is perceived to pose a threat. It's critical to note here that while the Orient as a whole was imagined as feminine, certain racial groups of men, specifically black and brown men, were gendered very differently. That is, with an animalistic, violent hypermasculinity. Which is why immigration from these countries to Western Europe was and continues to be portrayed as an invasion, as all male hordes creating havoc, harassing women and destroying the peace and civilization of the West. Western Europe shifts in these portrayals from masculine protector into helpless feminine victim, into nations depicted as pale damsels in distress, being symbolically stolen and violated, who her loyal subjects must rise up to defend. Loyal, devoted, a defender, someone who would rise to protect a nation, or perhaps even a kingdom. Who does that make you think of, I wonder? Link is a male elf-like Hylian, who throughout the vast majority of the games retains the same appearance. Blonde hair, pale skin, and blue eyes. This appearance distinguishes him from most other characters in the series, who are either non-humanoid races or lack his light eye and hair phenotypes. During the increased colonial expansion of the 1800s, a new quote-unquote science was emerging. A science of races, where categorizations were created by colonialists to construct the superiority and inferiority of various racialized groups. Shockingly enough, Western Europeans, according to skull shape and other made-up bullshit, were determined by this science to be intellectually and racially superior, the most superior Europeans being the most pure European ones, naturally. Now, under Western Orientalism, whiteness and blonde hair and blue eyes was already being associated with superiority, purity, morality, and goodness in colonial literature and art. But this emerging pseudoscience elevated this belief through the presentation of so-called rational proof and through the creation of new oppressive ideas, deterministic racial categories, and the desire for racial purity, ideas which would have devastating consequences. The term Aryan was initially used as a self-designator by Indo-Iranian peoples during ancient times, but in the 1850s it was co-opted into the pseudoscientific racial theories of French writer Arthur de Gobineau. Gobineau's category of Aryan as Nordic or Northern European with light phenotypes, blonde hair and blue eyes, formalised the archetype of the Aryan Superman, and would be essential to the racial propaganda of the Nazi regime in Germany during the 1930s and 40s. They believed the punitive Nordic or Aryan races, primarily those of German origin, were a master race, biologically, morally and physiologically superior to all other human races. The Nazi regime used this pseudo-scientific ideology to justify the genocide of millions of people, primarily ethnic and religious minorities deemed racially impure, including Jewish and Slavic people. So, what on earth does this have to do with Zelda? Well, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was profoundly influential on the franchise, according to creators Miyamoto and Tezuka, and there is evidence that Tolkien, despite expressing ardent disapproval of the Nazis' racial theories, included popular beliefs from his time about eugenics in Lord of the Rings. Some examples of this include opposition to race mixing, and the moral geography of Middle-earth, where good is in the west and evil is in the east. Tolkien's writings revolve around a crumbling nation-state, embodied in the fictional Middle-earth, being rescued by a white male-coded hero from the evil magic of Sauron, drawing comparisons with the central narrative of Link protecting the Kingdom of Hyrule from Ganondorf. Link's appearance also mirrors Tolkien's elves, whose nature as pure, pale-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed masters of art, culture and warfare parallels the Nazis' promotion of those phenotypes as indicative of cultural, biological and innate supremacy. These links between Zelda, Tolkien and racial eugenicism take on newfound resonance when we consider Tony Falala's view that Link embodies German philosopher Nietzsche's notion of the Übermensch, a godlike figure who must bring meaning back into the hostile, godless Hyrule. The Übermensch, an ideal appropriated by the Nazi regime to propagandize Aryan superiority, was Nietzsche's vision of the ideal aspirational man, who by dominating his environment and mastering his fate would bring order back to the world. Playing as Link, the gamer can master their environment and fate to unprecedented levels, completing feats of strength, bravery and courage, solving complex puzzles, mastering magic, rescuing royals and defeating powerful villains. Link, by single-handedly defeating Ganondorf and protecting the Triforce, symbolically defends the moral stability, security and safety of Hyrule, the white Western utopia, reinforcing Orientalist notions of white superiority in the process. These associations are strengthened by the allusion of Link to Arthurian legend, which contains some of the most romanticized visions of Western white masculine heroism. Link is a bloodline descendant/reincarnation of the legendary hero and often a Hylian knight, linking him to the Knights of the Round Table. Link wields a legendary blade known as the Master Sword, which he must pull from a sacred tomb or stone. This alludes to the Arthurian legend of the Sword in the Stone, where King Arthur as a child was the only one capable of pulling the legendary Excalibur from its resting place. However, in contrast to King Arthur's exceptional status and Link's existence as a predestined Übermensch, he is not framed in the series as an exceptional person, not by birth. He is of average, sometimes short build and height. He is perpetually mute, and he is continually outranked in some terms of size, social status and personality by fantastic creatures, monsters and societies. Link begins most Zelda games with humble, unexceptional origins. In Wind Waker, the player begins the game as a young boy on sleepy Outset Island, and in Twilight Princess they start as a teenage Link in the small rural village of Ordon. Link's progression is all inextricably linked to his status as the legendary hero. For example, he is assigned helper characters due to his destiny, like Fi in Skyward Sword, Midnight in Twilight Princess, and Navi in Ocarina of Time, who guide and advise the player in ways central to the plot. In Breath of the Wild, Link is first introduced as a boy with nothing, No weapons, no clothes, not even memories. He gains profound significance as being everything. However, the fate of Hyrule hangs on his shoulders when he reawakens to his destiny. This highlights Link's embodiment of fantasies of white male superiority, as his exceptional status is inextricably linked to the virtue of his bloodline and destiny, two deterministic concepts which have long been used by Orientalism to cement white men as the innate inheritors of global power. In this vein, Link's destiny to defeat Ganondorf and protect Hyrule is eerily reminiscent of the Western Orientalist duty to protect their culture and liberate, civilize and uplift the Orient from depravity, a similarity that becomes even more critical when we consider Zelda's role in the Zelda series. Zelda, the titular character of the Legend of Zelda series, is one of gaming's most iconic damsels in distress. This damsel in distress status originates from the fact that to take control of Hyrule and properly gain the power of the Triforce, Ganondorf tends to kidnap or possess Princess Zelda. Joyce Haftad and Iris Jung argue that throughout her incarnations, Princess Zelda is reduced to a plot object, the prize, rewarding Link for his violent and heroic masculine exploits. They argue that Zelda in the games largely remains a figurative leader, beautiful and wise yet passive, who rarely engages directly in the heroics of adventuring and defending her kingdom. This reality is enhanced by the fact Zelda is often physically imprisoned or shut away from the player's view throughout the games. In the Minish Cap, Zelda's object status becomes literal in her reduction to stone. In The Adventure of Link, she spends the entire game locked in her bedroom in deep slumber, and in Twilight Princess she is reduced to a puppet by Ganondorf, a symbolic object commanded by the needs of a man and the plot. Zelda, like Link, is distinctively white-coded and humanoid, largely depicted with blonde hair and blue eyes. Her appearance is conventionally feminine, with her typically wearing an ornate dress bearing the Hylian royal symbol. It is only when she veers away from this racial and gendered presentation that she is given significant agency and purpose beyond motivating Link in the games. This is because Zelda embodies Beauvoir's notion of the mythology of women in patriarchal societies, specifically the third component of women as idea. She is the symbolic embodiment of Hyrule, which is why her hyper-victimized state is intimately connected to her codification within white womanhood. The two major instances she does this is when she conceals her womanhood by disguising herself as the androgynous Sheik in Ocarina of Time, and when she transforms into the brown-skinned pirate Tetra in Wind Waker. Now, you might instinctively point to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom as exceptions to this. Zelda looks the same in those games, you say, but she is no damsel. She has a very active role. Yes, she does. And doesn't. Zelda, while having a huge presence in these games, is not actually present.
Look, Gary, there I am again! Look!
She is imprisoned, shut away, either holding off Calamity Ganon or as an eternal dragon. Her memories, her sacrifice, are used narratively to motivate and support Link, who still has to rescue her. She isn't adventuring alongside him in the same way Sheik and Tetra get to. Outside the confines of white womanhood, presenting as an androgynous or a racialized woman, she has the agency to directly assist Link and fight against attackers. In Wind Waker, Tetra is the leader of a ruthless pirate gang who plunder the high seas, and she breaks into the Forsaken Fortress, protects Link from danger by attacking Ganon, and accompanies him in his mission to the Temple of Gods. In Ocarina of Time, Sheik teaches Link songs for warping and helps him to acquire the Quickshot to access the temples of the Seven Sages. However, when she is revealed to be Princess Zelda in Ocarina of Time, she is kidnapped, or, in the case of Wind Waker, locked away in Hyrule Castle under the seas to protect her. What's interesting about her transformation in Wind Waker is that Zelda's skin tone changes when she becomes a royal again. The creative decision to make Tetra's skin tone brown as a pirate can be understood in several different ways. Firstly, her profession as a pirate mandates she labours in the hot sun all day, so a pale complexion could potentially break the logic of her character. Secondly, Japanese culture associates tan skin tones, particularly on women, with wild, unpredictable, rebellious personality traits, a product in part of the rebellious Japanese fashion subculture ganguru, which idolizes tan skin, traits that match Tetra's personality. Thirdly, the video game developers likely wanted to get her now well-established princess look into the game. Despite all of this, the change of her skin colour upon re-becoming the Princess of Hyrule has ideological implications. Why couldn't they have had a brown-skinned Zelda? It indirectly implies her brown skin is not befitting of Zelda's authority, purity, and position. This disparity in treatment makes sense when viewed through an Orientalist framework, where Zelda's white womanhood is critical to her nature as a symbolization of Hyrule, the white Christian utopia. This is why Zelda is the titular face of Hyrule, despite the king's existence in many games, and of the Zelda games altogether, despite Link being the protagonist. The games are literally named after her. This is bolstered by Zelda's character being grounded, like Hyrule, in medieval European conventions. The damsel in distress narrative of the pale-skinned maiden was a common feature of medieval fantasy and Arthurian legend. Link's rescue of Princess Zelda is reminiscent of the knight Lancelot's rescue of Princess Guinevere in Crétin de Troyes' late 12th century romance of Le Chevalier de la Charrette.
French it up, lover boy.
I'm not a machine. I can't just turn it on.
Oh, come here.
Which became incorporated into Arthurian canon. Emphasised in these depictions was the purity and fragility of white femininity, which symbolised the kingdom, requiring the protection and masculine labour of the knights. This dynamic between white womanhood and the nation has always been critical to Western Orientalist productions, especially due to the racialized dynamics of the colonial encounter. White womanhood, with its symbolic purity, fragility, and goodliness, came to symbolize the Western imperialist nation. Not only did this image soften and feminize the violence of imperialism, but also helped to rally the imperialist nation against colonized people, specifically black and brown men. The propagandized narrative of the sexual, physical, and moral defilement of white womanhood by Oriental savages was integral to rallying support for imperialist causes, a point which leads us on to the primary antagonist of the Zelda series, Ganondorf. Ganondorf is described throughout the series as evil incarnate, a cruel, vindictive, power-hungry creature with magical shape-shifting powers who craves chaos and disorder. He is consistently depicted across the Zelda games as being extremely dark or olive-skinned, tall and muscular, coated with a distinctly Middle Eastern, stereotypically Arab appearance, with a hooked, protruding nose, often a full beard, and red hair. His clothing and aesthetics draw from South Asian, Middle Eastern, and Spanish influences, tying this cultural allusion to that which is evil and other. In Wind Waker, Ganondorf wears a flowing black garb that is likely most inspired by the Chinese hanfu, but it is also reminiscent of a traditional Arabic bisht, commonly worn by men in Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. In Tears of the Kingdom, Ganondorf wears a yukata-inspired outfit, along with South Asian and Middle Eastern-inspired jewellery, and in Twilight Princess, his detailed crown of headpiece jewellery is reminiscent of South Asian bridal jewellery, like the Mang Tikka, popular in India and Pakistan. He immensely contrasts the pale, blue-eyed, blonde-haired Link and Zelda, who he towers over in games, even to a cartoonish extent in Wind Waker. Ganondorf evokes the Orientalist representation of black and brown men as a hyper-masculinized threat to Western countries, to the stability, security, and harmony of the white Christian utopia. Expressing the fear of the primitive other, seizing authority, power, and self-governance, lending extra weight to the fact Tetra's brown skin was not carried over in Wind Waker to her Zelda design. Ganondorf's kidnapping of Zelda adds a sexualized and gendered dynamic, where he becomes the predatory savage defiling and conquering white womanhood, and subsequently the white Western nation-state. Frantz Fanon identified the impact of this archetype in black skin, white masks, arguing that colonised men of colour, having internalised their representation as an agent of sexual and physical aggression, may come to perceive this as their primary route to power, in effect creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Ganondorf also occupies the Western Orientalist image of the Oriental Plague, of the Orient as a realm of moral, civilizational, and social chaos, depravity and evil that, if left unchecked by imperialists, would spread beyond its borders and infect the West. This is reinforced by the representation of Ganon's magic in many games, particularly Breath of the Wild and Twilight Princess, as a malignant black shroud which engulfs and corrupts the surrounding environment. This is further strengthened by Ganondorf's ability to transform into animalistic forms. In his Wind Waker boss fight, Ganondorf has several phases where he transforms into a spider, a snake and a puppet before returning back to his original form. In The Adventures of Link, Ganondorf exists solely in the form of Ganon, a corrupted boar, and in Breath of the Wild he similarly exists in a corrupted form as the Calamity, a deformed, monstrous creature. Ganondorf's ability to transform into animals corresponds to the Orientalist conception of racialized masculinities as primitive, inhuman and bestial, framing the Orient as a realm that needs Western domestication. This representation of Hyrule as a Western Christian utopia under threat by dark, malignant forces captures a very specific fear. The fear over the perceived downfall of Western civilization, ergo institutions of whiteness to the racialized other. But to fully understand Ganondorf's role in the Orientalism of Zelda, we need to consider his nature as a descendant of one of the most important races in the series, the Gerudo. The Gerudo as a race only appear in Zelda games: Ocarina of Time, Four Swords Adventures, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom. Despite this, they wield significant influence and importance within the series, especially considering Ganondorf is a Gerudo. The Gerudo, like Ganondorf, are a tall, brown-skinned, humanoid race who possess hooked, protruding noses, muscular physiques, and bright red hair. A matriarchal, almost all-female society, the Gerudo are distinctly modelled after the Amazonians, who were the all-female warrior race of Greek legend, treated by Western European culture as dangerous, exciting, and erotic. This patriarchal notion of the all-female warrior race as enticing yet dangerous mixes with old-fashioned Orientalism through the Gerudo, who are an amalgamation of non-Western cultural aesthetics and influences. In Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom they are, according to Ryan Khosrafi, a secretive people with the only foreign language in the game. They wield scimitars, a sword from the Middle East, and they live in a forbidden desert town. This representation is even fused into the game mechanics, with their main dungeon in Breath of the Wild being a giant mechanical camel. Meanwhile, in Ocarina of Time, the Gerudo Spirit Temple is distinctively Egyptian, using booby traps, having wall hieroglyphics, and requiring the player to fight the enemy Anubis. While the temple may be Egyptian in style, the goddess of the sands, the deity of the Gerudo people, employs Hindu imagery. She holds sacred items such as a torch, and she is half-serpent, evoking the Hindu worship of the divine half-human, half-serpent Naga of the Patula. The Gerudo's portrayal through an amalgamation of Arab, Egyptian, and Hindu cultural illusion suggests the Orientalist perspective of these cultures as interchangeable, exotic, and fantastical. This Orientalism is further suggested by the architecture of Gerudo Town in Breath of the Wild, which is similar to ancient Saudi Arabian market towns, and the theme that sounds distinctively South Asian or Middle Eastern. The Gerudo also wear stereotypically revealing Arabian dancer costumes in all their appearances. In both Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild, they wear ornate harem pants and skimpy tops, traditionally complete with a thin face veil. Veils which are particularly important to discussions of Orientalism. Veil, in both Western historic Orientalism and in contemporary debates, functions less as an article of clothing and more as a critical symbol, a divider between two worlds. These worlds are the rational, civilized, moral Christian West and the debased, immoral, uncivilized Islamic world. Medja Yengalu's study of the veil in Orientalist discourses linked its status as a divider to the Age of Enlightenment. This was a period of rigorous scientific, political, and philosophical debate that characterized 18th century European society, while colonial expansion increased. She argues that European Enlightenment required the total disenchantment of the world. Western Orientalist modernity, therefore, became tied to a new form of institutional power, based on transparency and visibility. This is reflected in an increased focus on documenting, exploring, extracting, categorizing, and producing knowledge. This doctrine of unveiling the truth became literalized in the Western colonial political doctrine to unveil the colonized woman. In historically colonized nations like Algeria and Iraq, Muslim women became categorized as subjects in need of correction, constructed as objects who need to be known, controlled, and exposed. Subsequently, according to Yengalulu, there is an intense Western fear and anxiety towards the veil, and a need to symbolically penetrate it. In Ocarina of Time, this reality is reproduced through the representation of the Gerudo as thieves, untrustworthy criminals, whose true motives and behaviour are initially concealed. The player as Link must sneak into, ergo penetrate their fortress and spirit temple to reveal the truth about their criminality and thwart their actions. But in Breath of the Wild, this Western Orientalist need to penetrate the veil becomes literalized through the mission where Link must disguise himself as a woman to sneak into Gerudo Town, which men are barred from entering. Not only is this a distinctively patriarchal fantasy, a voyeuristic stealth mission that operates as an exhilarating violation of a female-only space through deception, but it also intimately relates to the sexualized and racialized Orientalist desire to penetrate the other, which is hidden behind the metaphorical walls and the veil. This becomes further enmeshed in these power dynamics through the fact Link dons the veil, and he, embodying the white colonial explorer from foreign lands, becomes, through subverting his gender presentation, the one who is seen without truly being seen. The vast majority of women in Gerudo Town perceive him as female, in dialogue complimenting his womanly beauty and sharing secrets they wouldn't otherwise to a male intruder. In addition to this, the player as Link acquires crucial knowledge about Gerudo secrets, practices, and culture from this mission, which allow him to unlock further aspects of the game. Subsequently, this mission constitutes a thrilling, symbolic, and literal violation of the Gerudo sovereignty, privacy, and civilization. The potentially feminist subtext of this matriarchal society is also interrupted in the series by the existence of Ganondorf, as in Zelda lore, the male born once every 1,000 years is destined by Gerudo lore to become their king. This draws on the Orientalist trope of what Malak Aluha terms the semilogical classification of the colonial harem, which renders the problematics of cultural differences into one of sexual difference, upholding the Western Orientalist image of Arab culture and Islam as intrinsically patriarchal and male-worshipping. This Islamification of the Gerudo via the veil colludes with the greater illusion through their architecture and culture to Arab and Middle Eastern culture, a process constructing the greater conflicts between them and Hyrule through an Orientalist lens. In Ocarina of Time, the Gerudo are masters of horse riding, with the player needing to complete an archery range challenge at their fortress on horseback to proceed further in the game. Historically, horses were introduced to Europe from the Middle East, and Arabian horses were considered the finest of all, with Arab culture being praised by Western Orientalists for its horse-riding skill. In Ocarina of Time, this appearance is coupled with Gerudo's status as criminals and thieves, an allusion to the tales in the Arabian Nights of the legendary 40 thieves. But perhaps the most important aspect of the Gerudo's cultural illusion in Ocarina of Time is that it is quickly changed early release Their chief symbol was the crescent moon of Islam, and the Fire Temple, a demonic dungeon in the game associated with the Gerudo, had Islamic prayer music as its theme. This Islamic Orientalism is crucial, as in Ocarina of Time, the Gerudo and Hylians were established as dueling communities, staunch enemies locked in endless warfare. Hyrule, as we have established, is an amalgamation of the Christian civilizations of medieval northwestern Europe, and the Gerudo, as a mysterious enemy from an arid desert land southwest of Hyrule's imperial castle, parallels the Muslim-dominated Spanish kingdoms of the Middle Ages. A comparison heavily supported by the fact that the theme of Gerudo Valley in this game is heavily inspired by Spanish flamenco music. Subsequently, the entire Hylian Gerudo conflict is allegorical for the medieval religious crusades. The crusades were a series of religious wars initiated, supported, and sometimes directed by the Latin Church in the medieval period. The term refers specifically to the Eastern Mediterranean campaigns in the periods between 1095 and 1271 that had the objective of conquering the Holy Land, ergo Jerusalem, from Islamic rule. The Crusades were monumentally important for establishing the Western Orientalist conception of imperialism as the civilizing mission, whereby through the purity of Christianity, the dark and nefarious realms beyond Europe would be civilized and purified. An Orientalist archetype rose in the Western Christian imagination during the Crusades, which persists in discourses concerning the Middle East and the West today. This was of the quote-unquote Muslim barbarian, which portrayed those racialized as Muslim as immoral, demonic, animalistic creatures who sought to plunder and subjugate the Christian world. This undeniably bears similarity to the representation Zelda of Ganondorf, a Gerudo, as a demonic animalistic villain who brings chaos, disorder, anarchy, and evil in his quest to take over Hyrule. We can even situate Ganondorf as the equivalent of General Saladin, who led the Muslim military campaigns during the Crusades, due to his role as the major opposition and villain, quote-unquote, of the Crusades, who sought to take over Jerusalem, here Hyrule, from the perspective of the Christian West. While Link can be considered the series equivalent of Richard Lionheart, the legendary knight and military leader, he fought to prevent Saladin's actions during the Third Crusades, a comparison supported by the use of a Christian Crusader cross on his shield in earlier games. Consequently, the series builds an orientalizing, allegorical binary between the evil Gerudo, representing the Islamic, Muslim world, ergo the mysterious, dangerous, erotic Orient, and the good Hylians, representing the Christian, Western utopia. This dichotomy between those codified as Western, as pure, noble, and harmonious versus the demonic East, can also be understood as influenced by Tolkien, who had this dynamic in Lord of the Rings between the men of the West and the orcs of the East. This Orientalism, arguably present throughout the Zelda series, is not just communicated by the demonization of other races, it is also constructed through their hyper-victimization and reduction as objects of white saviourship. notable and highly criticised aspect of the Zelda series' handling of race is its racial essentialism. High fantasy, of which Tolkien was a major architect, has a tendency to divide the world into established races, with clear deterministic physical, psychological, and cultural characteristics. Tolkien's villainous orcs, for example, were made to appear unmistakably dark-skinned, hailing from unspecified tropical islands from the south. Zelda arguably shares this very Tolkienesque racial essentialism, strengthened by the strict geographical and physical segregation of the races within the games. This racial essentialism is not limited to the villainous races of the series, as is prominent through the Gorons. Despite their favourable treatment throughout the Zelda series, the Gorons maintain striking parallels with historic racialised caricatures rooted in anti-blackness. This anti-blackness was produced, medicalised and disseminated during the Western colonial era, particularly during the era of transatlantic slavery, in the form of animations, posters, films, music, books and adverts. The Gorons can be seen as corresponding to two historic sites of anti-blackness: American caricatures of blackness, and the Western Orientalist conception of black indigenous tribes, more specifically the Australian Aborigines. It's critical to note that anti-blackness as a form of knowledge and behaviour was also globally imported by colonialism, shaping perceptions of blackness in the country Zelda was created, Japan. Japan is a largely racially homogenous country that suffers from deeply rooted anti-blackness. This anti-blackness is similar to that of the West, who during the 1980s and early 1990s had an immense experience of intercultural exchange with Japan, in part due to the mass success of Nintendo and series like The Legend of Zelda in the country. Japan's subsequent exposure to more Western media helped further import and entrench racist practices like blackface and minstrelsy into Japanese culture, practices which only recently are being viewed as problematic in the country. Subsequently, the Gorons were designed within this very specific cultural context, where practices like minstrelsy were normalised as inoffensive entertainment. Minstrelsy was an American theatrical form, popular from the 19th century to the early 20th century, founded on the comic reenactment of racial stereotypes. This racist theatrical form featured the exaggeration of stereotypical West African phenotypes, often through the form of white actors donning blackface. However, in-person performances were not the only form of minstrelsy. Adverts, films, songs, books and animations, especially from the 1920s to the 1940s, like Warner Brothers' Scrub Me Mama with a Boogie Beat and Swing Social, perpetuated minstrelsy. The Gorgons, arguably, in this interpretation, constitute a modern-day manifestation of minstrelsy, or at the very least, they draw on some level from these archetypes, through the codification of fantasy. The Gorons are a race of creatures made from volcanic rock, who live up Death Mountain, the area of Hyrule created by the goddess Din of Power. The Gorons possess exaggerated features that match minstrel caricatures. In certain games more than others, the exaggeration of these features is more prominent. These include dark, rough-looking skin, prominent lips that, especially in Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild, sharply contrast their skin, and incomplete set of teeth with gold fillings. The Gorons also have, in many games like Twilight Princess, hair made from rocks and rubble that mimic afro-textured hair, with Garbus's fade and Chief Darbus's flat top evoking popular Black American hairstyles from the 90s. The Gorons, in addition to this, possess a gait similar to the minstrelsy characters of Western animation, with hunched over shoulders and swaying bodies, used to emphasize Black Americans' supposedly primitive, inherently comedic nature. The Gorons even use slang that is undeniably similar to Black American slang, calling each other in the Mallow Mark in Twilight Princess and up Daft Mountain in Breath of the Wild, brother. There is also Chief Darenia's dance in Ocarina of Time to the music of the Lost Woods, which with its exaggerated, gyrated, comical nature, accompanied with him saying "what a hot beat," is reminiscent of the minstrel animation Juke Joint. This is strengthened by how the Gorons are associated musically in particular games, like in Breath of the Wild, where the theme of Goron City is flamboyant improvisational jazz, full of comedically brassy trumpets, saxophones and drums. A genre created by and heavily associated with African Americans. This specific comedic energy of this theme, which is almost reminiscent of circus music, increases the Gorons' link to minstrelsy even more. The Gorons' proximity to anti-black imagery is further reinforced through their representation as a stereotypically tribal race. They live inside caves up the top of a mountain, and throughout the games, particularly in Twilight Princess, they wear body paint and loincloths, common practices among indigenous tribes in sub-Saharan Africa and the Australian Aborigines. Their culture is extremely hypermasculine, with a strict hierarchy based on chiefs, and a focus on physical strength, dueling and brawling.
Well, I seem to be seriously wounded.
With Link having to best varying Gorons throughout the series in feats of strength. The theme of Goron City in Ocarina of Time, in contrast to the jazz of Breath of the Wild, is tribal chanting, drums and marimba, enhancing this traditional Orientalist tribal association. In addition to this, the Goron slang brother, as said, is heavily associated with Australian Aboriginal culture. These parallels with the Gorons is additionally supported by the fact almost all the races depicted in the Zelda franchise draw some influence from real-world racial groups and cultures. An example of this is the anthropomorphized Rito tribe in Wind Waker, a civilization of humanoid birds who in their clothing, architecture and culture allude to Southern America. Their theme utilizes Andean instruments, including the pan flute zampona and a charango, a traditional style lute used throughout South America, and they live up in the mountains on Dragon Roost Island, mirroring the living conditions of the traditional cultures up the Andes Mountains. These parallels arguably produce Orientalism through the projection of specific cultures and racial groups into literal inhuman fantasy archetypes, strengthening the colonial notion of non-Western, non-white identities as fundamentally other to a white male default humanity. The races in Zelda are, however, not portrayed negatively. In fact, they are largely portrayed as being the opposite, full of kindness and wisdom, ready and eager to help Link to save Hyrule, which has its own ideological implications.
Hey, by the way, congrats on becoming the princess's appointed knight.
Apart from the Gerudo, who remain tainted by Ganondorf's presence throughout the games, and are only portrayed in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom as wholly on the side of good, all the other races the player encounters as Link are portrayed as profoundly good. These races are so universally moral that if threats emerge from them in Zelda games, it's typically the product of their ruler being possessed or cursed. Like in Twilight Princess, where the Goron boss of Death Mountain, Phoebus, is simply possessed by a spirit of the Twilight Realm. Or in, most recently, Tears of the Kingdom, where the Goron champion Yunobo was cursed by Ganondorf's puppet Zelda. This overwhelming goodness can be seen as producing Orientalism through the image of the noble savage. The noble savage is a prominent Orientalist production and literary stock character who embodies the concept of the uncorrupted other, a wild innocent who has not been corrupted by civilization. This Orientalism, in contrast to that of the brutal savage, is the Western image of the Orient as exotic, spiritual and pure, uncorrupted by the cruelties and immorality of advanced civilization and culture. Scholars have long recognised that both the noble and the brutal savage are Orientalist fantasies that kept indigenous peoples in a suspended state of either elevated purity or perpetual evil. Both typecasts rely heavily on the notion the indigenous peoples of the world were in an original, infantile state, the primitive ancestor to the modern West. Metaphors of time forged the social relationships of colonialism, and Zelda is a series that has a long-standing fixation on time, with Lee Sherlock arguing time haunts the series through its themes, game mechanics, titles, and narratives. Ocarina of Time, Link to the Past, and Twilight Princess directly reference time in their titles and include it in their gameplay, and devices like the Gate of Time, Ocarina of Time, and Mask of Majora allow players to literally control time. The games possess an inherent theme of time, through each installment acting as the continuation of an ongoing ancient legend. Link's ability to travel through time not only highlights his exceptional status, but also has greater implications. Edward Said argued that the Orient was not only portrayed as a former, primitive version of the West by Orientalism, but also as a world frozen in time, one that never changes, progresses, or evolves. Throughout the Zelda games, when Link time travels, we see little change in the technology, culture, behaviour, or living standards of the various races. However, the Kingdom of Hyrule and Hylian culture undergoes evolution. In Skyward Sword, pointed to as the first game in certain timelines, the ancient Hyrulean ancestors live in a small rural society on a floating rock in the sky. In Twilight Princess, Hylians have established their kingdom on the land below, and in Wind Waker, the Hylians sail the seas and live on islands. In Breath of the Wild, the Hylians have become so technologically advanced, they created an army of mechanical robot guardians to fight off intruders. The Hylians are granted progression, evolution, and variation across games, while other races, especially the Gorons and Gerudo, remain static in their technological sophistication and cultural expression, which in this reading reinforces the Orientalist myth of the other as static, unchanging, and underdeveloped. The Hylians are the active race of the Zelda universe, innovating, evolving, and ruling, while the other races are more passive, this passivity translating into the role they play in the game's narratives. Here is where the importance of a computational analysis of the Legend of Zelda series becomes apparent, when theorizing its production of Orientalist fantasy. Link, throughout the Zelda games, occupies what Teju Cole terms the White Saviour. As the player as Link explores Hyrule, you visit the territory of other races and often at their request, solve their problems. You defeat their enemies in dungeons, recover their treasure, and help townspeople in side quests, a process which frames these races as needing the intellectual and physical prowess of Link, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed white boy blessed by the goddess, to rescue them. In Wind Waker, Link saves the flying warrior Rito tribe from a dragon that has been plaguing their town.
Hey, Strom! You're dead! Ugh, he can't hear you, idiot!
Despite being a child in this game who is incapable of flight. In Twilight Princess, Link rescues the Chief Goron from an evil spell by defeating him in a contest of strength, something which the Gorons, renowned for their strength and bravery, were unable to do. In Breath of the Wild, the Gerudo clan, despite being a race of fierce warriors, need the Ubermensch's help to retrieve the Thunderhelm from the Yiga clan, who are portrayed in the game as comedically incompetent. In the vast majority of the games, the other races are non-playable and do not rescue the Hylians or save Hyrule, instead being in more of a supporting role, with the contribution of the warriors in Breath of the Wild being posthumous because they couldn't defeat their blight, and the sages in Tears of the Kingdom being barred from the final battle with Ganondorf. An exception to this is the Sheikah, who rescue and direct Link throughout the series. This subversive power shift is however dampened by the fact they are a servant race in-universe, ordained by the Hylian goddesses to serve the Hylians. When we consider that the Sheikah, especially in Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time, are coded as people of colour, their servitude to the white-coded race of the Hylians who have been chosen by the god reproduces Orientalist fantasies of white Christian superiority. This all promotes the Orientalist fantasy of white saviorism and benevolent imperialism, in which the white colonizer positions their rule as necessary for the harmony and happiness of the subjected. Through this process, Link is established as competent, courageous, and strong above all others. The problems he solves and races he saves framed as helping him become the hero Hyrule needs. Through this, the computational processes of each Zelda game arguably become mired in these ideological implications. After defeating the dungeon of a race or civilization, the player is rewarded with sacred artifacts, a new heart chamber, rupees, precious collectibles, new weaponry, and the ability to progress further in the game. Even interactions with random townspeople and the surrounding environment are inbuilt with the same aim: side quests, hidden items, and secrets, serving to increase Link's stamina, life hearts, weaponry, and strength. Ultimately, you exist in a curated virtual world that is formulated around uplifting Link's goals, strengths, and needs, which in an Orientalist framework embodies what Edward Said termed the underground self. The underground self was the West's use of the Orient as a civilizational, economic, and psychological means to fuel their growth and power, alleviating their weaknesses and failings in the process, bearing major similarities with Link using his surrounding environment and the plight of other races to forge his strength as a hero. This representation becomes further linked to Orientalist ideas of inherent superiority when we consider the myth of meritocracy structured into the gameplay of the Legend of Zelda series. Zelda, like most video games, depends computationally on meritocratic ideologies, because the player's individual talent and skill fuels their progress and success. Subsequently, gaming is a place where the ideology of meritocracy runs rampant and unchecked. According to Arthur Chu, meritocracy serves to cover up structural inequality and personalised responsibility, to make each individual appear to be responsible for his or her failure. A consequence of meritocracy is that it becomes difficult, and even taboo, to recognise how success is rooted partly in inherited position rather than individual talent. Meritocratic narratives have always been integral historically to the Western imperialist project, a common one being that Western civilization has simply worked harder and innovated better in order to become more technologically advanced and rich in resources, deserving its superior global status. Meritocracy serves today to undermine and ignore the societal disadvantages faced by racial and gendered minorities, constructing a hierarchy of white male superiority due to the assumption that greater achievements and status as a collective is the sole product of skill, hard work, and talent. Chu's comment that meritocracy is a compelling ground on which to build the impression that they are simply better than others are collides with the virtual embodiment of this meritocracy in the Legend of Zelda games, Link. While Link's narrative is far from meritocratic, as the hero destined by the gods to save Hyrule, he is the avatar through which this meritocratic gaming experience occurs, situating those who look like Link as being divinely skilled, talented, and resourceful via the player. Ludus and Pagia are Latin terms, derived from game theorist Roger Callot's examination of play. Ludus gameplay is characterized by following the rules of sanctioned gameplay, encouraging specific behavior which follows the designed order of the game. Padua gameplay, meanwhile, is defined as the basic freedom central to play to simulate distraction and fantasy, or as unstructured play. This includes gameplay involving hacks.
Huh? What's that? Vinny, we saw Todd on the boat. What do you mean you saw Todd on the boat?
Glitching, prioritizing side quests over the main game, and simple aimless exploration. Arguably, both of these styles of gameplay contribute to the production of Orientalist fantasy. Padua, as a freestyle rule-breaking mode of gameplay, constructs the colonial fantasy of the Orient as an exotic, sensational realm of free-fledged exploration. As we play as Link, travelling around Hyrule in open-world immersive games like Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild, visiting far-flung places and meeting new races, we find endless discovery. We indulge our desires, collect items, explore at our leisure, and break established constraints. Meanwhile, Luigi's gameplay, promoted more by Zelda games such as Link to the Past and Skyward Sword, echo perspectives of the colonial mission as a linear game to win and conquer your environment. Building on this link between the gameplay of Zelda and colonialism, there's something else we have to discuss: the series' use of maps. Bringing us on to Douglas Wilson's exploration of the spatial dynamics of warping in Wind Waker through Michel Foucault's theory of panoptic, 2D, and everyday space. Douglas Wilson argues that warping, transporting instantaneously to pre-visited areas in-game via a map, induces a tourist-like consumption of space, which, of course, has ideological implications, when we consider that warping in Zelda often includes going to other races' territories. A central feature of Orientalism has always been the reduction of the Orient to an exotic tourist spot, a realm the colonizer can travel to and from with the utmost ease. The West's technological capacity to travel quickly and efficiently via boat and later railway and plane massively boosted their imperialist domination. The fact that Link is the only character in the games with this technology, largely, symbolically mirrors this unequal power relation. Warping in the Zelda games also requires a 2D map interface, an interface which in Wind Waker particularly simulates the perspective of looking down at the world as a god. This not only heightens the power fantasy of Link as Übermensch VAV his perspective, but also alludes back to common colonial practices. John Brian Harley, famous for his argument maps constitute a form of language, argued maps are inherently involved in power relations, in claiming and configuring existing space. Suvik Mukherjee argued that cartography has always been a key element in colonial empire building, through the colonial construction of space used to cut up the world into claims for the colonizer. So really, games which use colonial techniques of domination like exploring, trading, map-making, and military maneuvering allow players to create colonial pasts and futures. Not only does the Zelda series feature map-making through its sea charts and warp towers, but it also allows players to employ these other colonial techniques, categorizing, exploring, and discovering new environments, collectibles, peoples, and weaponry through their travels. So, there is an argument to be made that Zelda is Orientalist, or at least deploys imagery, themes, and plots that draw strong parallels with Orientalism. What does this mean? Does this mean that Nintendo was bad, or that they intended this? No, not at all. A lot can be said about the context of Japan, and we can speculate about how it may have influenced this Orientalism in the Zelda series, like its racial homogeneity, its conservative attitudes to gender and race, its policy of westernization after US occupation post-World War II, its fascination with and romanticization of eras of English history, like the Victorians and the medieval royals, its lengthy and brutal colonial past, its lengthy cultural exchanges with the West, and its cultural focus on conformity, amongst other things. Ultimately, the developers were simply seeking to create enjoyable, expansive, epic games, and they succeeded by drawing from a wealth of historical, cultural, and literary influences. Orientalism was a byproduct so frequent, so subconscious, and so baked into global history and culture that it can be very difficult to see. The point of this essay never was to speculate on intent, but rather to highlight how pervasive Orientalism truly is and how long-standing impact can be seen everywhere, if you know your history. And to demonstrate that someone can deeply, deeply love a piece of media while still remaining critical of it. It's so easy to feel like criticism of the media we love is a personal or malicious attack, that it should be reserved for the stuff we hate, watch, or cringe at, to dismiss it as nitpicking, over the top, analysing too deeply, like criticism is an act designed to steal your enjoyment. Too often, we brush over analysing the harder to swallow aspects of what we enjoy. I am guilty of this too. You want to pretend it's perfect because it held a precious importance to you. But in doing that, we shut ourselves off from meaningful forms of discussion and growth. Nothing I've discussed in this video essay has changed the fact that I love The Legend of Zelda. The series has brought me and so many people so much joy, so much entertainment.
I'm sure it's this. That harp piece could be the Triforce. Oh, shit! It's... Yes!
And so much happiness. Its worlds, characters, and experiences have always been there for me when the world outside necessarily hasn't. And I will always appreciate it. But what I have discussed has helped me grow my knowledge of Orientalism, of the fantasy genre, and of gaming's unique and powerful storytelling mechanics. I hope, regardless of if you agree or not with my argument, the discussions here have been meaningful for you too. Thanks for watching.